Jackson wasn't the only main leading cause of the marches, but also voting requirements. Poll taxes were a major problem for African Americans since many of them were poor and couldn't always afford to pay the poll taxes. New literacy requirements placed tests which reduced the number of black citizens able to vote, and the Australian ballot was mainly placed in black districts where it listed all of the candidates for each office and had to be read to be used. The NAACP was a significant group that was funded way before the marches in 1909, but a group of prominent intellectuals whose main goal was to promote equality of rights and also to eradicate caste or race prejudice among the citizens of the U.S. They had many successes, such as getting the Supreme Court to rule grandfather clauses in the white primary unconstitutional, as well as its most celebrated victory in the Brown versus Board of Education of Top Kansas, where the NAACP persuaded the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn separate but equal and legally mandated racial segregation of public schools, a violation to the Children's 14th Amendment. Another group, known as the Congress of Racial Equality CORE, was founded in 1942 by a pacifist group. CORE set up First Freedom Roll, where a group of white and black activists and students from SNCC left Washington, D.C. on two buses where at each stop the riders planned on challenging every form of segregation met by the bus passenger. The KKK, still being a problem, attacked the riders near Anniston or Mother's Day by burning the Greyhound bus and beating Freedom Riders on the Trailway buses. Several other attacks happened afterwards, and every time no police showed up, making it so that the riders had to take an unannounced flight out. Two more very significant events which occurred before the marches were MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech, which was televised nationally, where King argued for such things as the need for racial equality and a unified nation, as well emphasizing despite the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were truly free. Another significant event just prior to the marches were JFK's assassination, who was on MLK's side, which left MLK and other civil rights leaders unaware of what Lyndon B. Johnson was going to do once he becomes president. The three marches contain many significant people who assisted African Americans with getting their voting rights back, and also people who triggered the marches to begin. The Selma marches took place on March 7, 1965 to March 21st, 1965. The three Selma marches were 54 miles long in total, which started from the highway from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. Selma marches took place due to African Americans having their civil rights stolen from them, especially their 15th Amendment, which is supposed to guarantee voting rights for them. Due to the mistreatment of the African Americans, they began their peaceful protesting in an attempt to gain their civil rights from the U.S. Senate. The first march, Bloody Sunday, occurred on March 7, 1965. The 600 men and women from Brown Chapel all the way crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. African Americans felt poorly treated due to police brutality and segregation, which was mainly due to the Jim Crow laws, which segregated African Americans from water fountains, buses, bathrooms, schools, etc. Turnaround Tuesday occurred on March 9, 1965. The 2,000 protesters marched from Brown Chapel to the Edmund Bridge, where MLK Jr. found himself in a dilemma. Before Martin Luther King Jr. announced to the marchers to turn back around, he delivered a speech known as "How Long, Not Long," which was a message to provide marchers with the hope of reinsurance, emphasizing that their cause would soon guarantee victory and that justice will prevail. At the time of marches, George Wallace was the governor. He felt strongly against the marches, feeling that the Jim Crow laws did not justice to people of color. George Wallace expressed this especially in his 1963 inaugural address, where he said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever," which strongly declared his support for racial segregation and his opposition to desegregation. Lyndon B. Johnson was president at the time, and he asked MLK Jr. to postpone the marches due to him believing that this could provoke violence in other nearby cities. The first march, Bloody Sunday, gathered around 600 protesters. The second, Turnaround Tuesday, MLK gathered about 2,000 people heading towards the site of Bloody Sunday and were turned around back by Clark and Major John Cloud. The last march went to Montgomery and gathered around 25,000 people for a peaceful final march. The final march occurred on March 21st, 1965, but no violence occurred. George Wallace didn't try intervening or no state troopers tried attacking, therefore it was more of a celebration march. Just prior to the final march, the Voting Rights Act was brought up to Congress on March 17, 1965, and was later signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson and passed on August 6, 1965.
The march's protests grew in size because of the public outrage over Bloody Sunday and how violent state troopers were acting towards African Americans, using violence instead of peace. Not only that, but also news stations such as CBS broadcasted the marches live, which made many people feel sympathetic for them and support the marches. A strategy that was used during the march was using children for the marches. This was very effective because if state troopers were to harm the children, it would make them look bad, but also was a bad idea because it would make marchers look bad for using children who could have been harmed. Another strategy both black and white civil rights activists enacted were freedom rides, which happened before the marches in 1961. Freedom rides were when those black and white civil rights activists embarked on buses to protest against the segregation. Their main goal was to challenge the Jim Crow laws and desegregate public areas. One more strategy civil rights activists used during the Selma marches were mass arrests, where they filled as many jails as they could as a form of nonviolent resistance aiming to highlight the inequitable justice system as well as gain media attention and support, ultimately being a main pressure for the government to pass legislation protecting their voting rights. The Selma marches to Montgomery mainly occurred because when Jimmy Lee Jackson, an activist towards civil rights and Deacon, was peacefully protesting unarmed in a voting rights march, he was brutally beaten and not long after fatally shot by an Alabama state trooper, truly beginning the first Selma March and raising tensions between the African Americans and the U.S. Senate and President Lyndon B. Johnson. Because of his death, civil rights leaders focused their attention on Governor George Wallace and proceeded with their 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery. James Reeb was an American white Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston, Massachusetts, who answered Martin Luther King Jr.'s call for clergy to support the nonviolent protest movement for voting rights, and during the march was beaten to death by segregationists. Viola Liuzzo was also a Unitarian Universalist who came in to support the Selma to Montgomery marches for voting rights, who after the marches was shot by 3 KKK members. And the LCLC played a big part in organizing the events of this 3-day protest by organizing nonviolent protests, training local activists, and advocating for civil rights legislation. The Dallas County Voters League, DCVL, founded before World War II, served as the main local base for organizing and activism. The DCVL worked to register many black voters while facing a lot of white resistance and played a key role in setting up the marches. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, also played a crucial part in setting up the marches in its early stages. The SNCC worked together with the DCVL and others in coordinating the marches and attempting to register as many African Americans as they could while also facing arrest and white resistance. Jonathan Daniels was one more person who responded to Martin Luther King Jr.'s call. And after the marches, he stayed to work on integration of churches and voting rights. Eugene Bull Connor was a white supremacist who during the marches acted against the peaceful protests by ordering the use of fire hoses, police dogs, and batons against the nonviolent protesters during the marches, and the children as well during the children marches. Finally, John Lewis, Hosea Williams, Bob Mance, and Albert Turners were also all significant because they were all leaders of the first march. John Lewis was a chairman in the SNCC, and he organized events such as Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, and the Selma to Montgomery marches. Hosea Williams led Bloody Sunday alongside John Lewis and also played a key role in voter registration. Bob Mance was the secretary for SNCC and also helped establish the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And Albert Turners worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr. as the Alabama field secretary for the SCLC. 13 marchers were brutally beaten and killed during Bloody Sunday, and one person, James Reeb, was killed during Turnaround Tuesday. No one died during the final march, therefore 14 people died in total over the span of the 3 marches, although some people, such as Jimmy Lee Jackson, died before the marches. With the end of the marches, African Americans were finally guaranteed their rights. Although segregation began disappearing, this didn't stop racism, in which African Americans didn't give up and kept pushing for equality by planning movements. This is seen today when African Americans set up the Black Lives Movement.